Welcome and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ethan Venneklassen, and I'm the Head of Advocacy and Communications here at ID 2020. In a normal year, we would have held the ID 2020 Summit in September in conjunction with the UN General Assembly. Each year, the summit offers an opportunity for us to bring together leading experts in digital identity from industry, government, and the social sector. But of course, this year has been, well, anything but normal. So we launched this summit series so that we could continue to live up to our commitment to keep our community connected, foster collaboration, and facilitate learning, both among digital ID practitioners and across sectors. There's no question we would rather have seen you all in person, but we've been pleasantly surprised by the positive response that we've received to these webinars. This is above all a testament to our panelists. We've been profoundly grateful to each and every one of them for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us and share their expertise, opinions, and wisdom. One of the benefits of this format is that we're not constrained by the limitations of space. And as a result, we've been able to engage with a far larger and broader range of audience over the course of these 5 sessions. We've enjoyed presenting this series and are planning additional webinars that we will be hosting on an ongoing basis, though on a less frequent cadence. But as for our Summit Sessions webinar series, this is it, the final session. We're absolutely thrilled to have Congressman Bill Foster with us today as our closing keynote speaker. And before I introduce our moderator for today's session, I'd like to take the opportunity to remind everyone that these sessions are being recorded and archived on the media page of the ID 2020 website at id2020.org. So if you missed a session, you can certainly go back and listen at your convenience. I'd also like to invite you to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as time permits. With that, it's my privilege to introduce our moderator for today's session, Blythe Masters. Blythe is an industry partner at the fintech private equity firm Motive Partners and is responsible for sourcing and executing investment opportunities with a focus on thematic strategy and development and value creation for Motive portfolio companies. Prior to joining Motive, Blythe served as CEO of Digital Asset, provider of the world's leading smart contract language, DAML, and spent 27 years at JP Morgan, where she rose to the level of managing director by the age of 28. It would take me far too long to list the numerous corporate and philanthropic boards on which she sits. It is, however, worth noting that she was recently nominated to the board of the Credit Suisse Group, so I think congratulations in order. We're incredibly lucky to have Blythe with us as a member of the ID 2020 Board of Directors and are grateful to her for agreeing to serve as our moderator today. Blythe, welcome.
Thanks, Ethan. And it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Congressman Bill Foster. Welcome. Congressman Foster represents Illinois' 11th Congressional District and has done since 2013. And actually prior to that also represented the 14th District from 08 to 11. So he has a distinguished career in public service. Importantly, he's a member of the House Science and Technology and the House Financial Services Committees. And he chairs the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. He was also named to the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus. So one of the Congress people who is most focused on ensuring that science and logic informs what goes on in government. So thank you for that. The reason perhaps why he does all of this is that he is actually also the only Ph.D. physicist in Congress. Prior to joining Congress, he worked as a high energy physicist and particle accelerator designer at the Fermi National Accelerator Lab. And there was part of the team that discovered or proved the existence of the top quark, the heaviest known form of matter, denser even than Congress. So of most relevance also to our discussion today, the Congressman is the author of something known as HR 8215, or otherwise known as the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020, and is one of the leading voices in Congress on issues relating to digital identity. We thank you for that, and I will pass it over to you, Congressman, for your remarks.
Surely, and it's well, thank you for all that, and good afternoon or what it may be. well, thank you for that introduction. I sometimes introduce myself as saying that I represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the U.S. Congress, but I think I'm also 100% of the strategic reserve of integrated circuit designers and blockchain programmers and several other things, but actually also a businessman. When I was 19, my little brother and I started a company with $500 from my parents that now makes most of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. And so I went that, the well-trodden path from theatrical stage lighting to high energy particle physics to the U.S. Congress. So I'm just another one of them. But I'd really want to thank ID 2020 for inviting me here. And it's always an interesting question what fraction of my prepared remarks I'll actually give. So we'll run that experiment now. But it's actually true that the issue of identity is one that is growing more and more relevant as our economy becomes increasingly reliant on the digital space. And as was mentioned, I'm proud to serve as the chair of the Financial Services Committee's Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. Where, among other things, we had a hearing dedicated to issues with digital identity, which are really at the heart of so many questions in financial services and just life online. And the COVID-19 crisis has really called to attention the urgency of discussing many of these challenges about proving digital identity and specifically what should be done by Congress to ensure that identities are protected. The COVID pandemic has laid bare a large number of areas where we have to raise our game to promote a secure digital identity. Just generally the increased vulnerability to identity fraud as more and more consumer spending moves online. The potential need for things like digital immunity certificates or certificates to demonstrate vaccination or antibody immunity, which remain very controversial. And also the more general problem of authenticating yourself for access to medical records, in which we've actually had some legislative progress there. Secure voting and proving that you are actually eligible to vote and proving your identity at a polling place is an obvious application of provable digital identity that probably we could stand some improvement there too. Central bank digital currencies and other digital assets, I think, will be one of the things that really drive this field in the coming years. I'm happy to talk for all of my time about our efforts to promote central bank digital currencies. But it's, you can have the most secure blockchain in existence and it does you no good if people are operating with fraudulent identities on it. And the need for government, just all by itself, its needs to connect digitally to everyone, including those who are traditionally underbanked. This came through in a big way when we said, okay, we're going to have these stimulus per capita payouts. And we found we did not have a list of U.S. citizens who are eligible to get those payments. And I think there is generally, certainly in the U.S., an increased sensitivity toward anti-corruption, anti-money laundering. We used to be looking down at the world and for reasons good and not so good. But right now, I think we understand that there are difficulties in the United States all the way to the top. And that we have to join the rest of the world in having another real run at anti-corruption efforts and transparency efforts. This will also come up in the context of online speech, also a very hot topic, and the desire that many people have for a controlled amount of anonymity and a controlled amount of legal traceability on different platforms, both in an individual context and also a campaign context. One of my biggest single concerns is simply identity fraud and what we can do as policymakers to equip people to safely interact in the digital marketplace. In 2018, the estimate is about $16 billion was stolen from U.S. consumers. And that does not include more indirect future costs of having a compromised identity. And I guess I don't have to remind this audience that we all know criminals have a lot of tools at their disposal to get at sensitive consumer financial data. Phishing attempts, ransomware is on everyone's radar, and malware attacks, they just become routine and more sophisticated week by week. And the financial services sector is actually on the front lines of that battle. More than 25% of all malware attacks hit banks and other financial service organizations, more than any other industry. Financial institutions, spend billions of dollars every year on cybersecurity and over 25 billion a year on anti-money laundering and know your customer compliance costs that could be made much simpler with a secure digital ID ecosystem. So looking forward, I think there are a number of things that we can do in Congress to make portable, reliable, and secure digital IDs a reality. For one thing, I'm encouraged that the Treasury Department is really focused on this issue, and I hope and believe that it will continue to be a focus in the next administration. Customer verification and authentication is obviously important for anti-money laundering, market surveillance, financial intelligence purposes, and know your customer obligations are a key compliance obligation for banks and will be equally important as sort of banking and tech merge in the coming decade. Traditionally, U.S. banks have been pretty good at operating in very highly regulated environments and regulatory frameworks that require very strong security and identity verification procedures, and we're going to have to adopt those in a larger arena. And they also have the advantage that they have moved they have a very large user base that's moved pretty quickly into online banking. Something like 160 million Americans use online banking services last year, but the identity protection record there is not perfect. I'd also like to venture to say that if banks don't work together on a digital ID scheme, that big tech is going to be more than happy to do so. There's sometimes I view you have these giant tech firms and giant bank firms, and if you talk to big bank CEOs, they, to a person, have a plan to convert themselves to tech firms over the coming decade. And of course, all the giant tech firms are getting into banking. So I sort of view this as like two giant sets of monsters facing at each other over a gulf and trying to see that the poor consumer in the middle doesn't get crushed during that the ongoing battle. For my money, I believe that banks are subject to much more rigorous regulatory and compliance framework than big tech. And so I think things will have to move in the direction of making big tech, forced to respect all of the hard-learned lessons that we've learned in regulating banks and financial services. But beyond financial services, there are a lot of challenges in the broader citizen consumer digital identity space with regard to figuring out who is really who online. As I mentioned, identity authentication for medical records will continue to drive development in this space. And recently, Representative Mike Calley, who's a Republican from Pennsylvania, a very conservative Republican with whom I agree on approximately nothing, but he and I got together on an amendment attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, which removes something called Section 510 from the Labor HHS bill, which prohibits federal funds for adoption of a unique patient identifier. If you've ever wondered why you go into some new clinic or hospital and you have to fill out all of these forms, and why can't you just say, okay, here is my ID card, or here is my number, my unique patient identifier, and then automatically pull in all the electronic records, because that's the way it works in other countries. It's because there has been for the last 25 years a federal law prohibiting that. And so we got that successfully repealed unanimously in the U.S. House. And if it gets passed by the Senate and enacted, this will allow HHS to move forwards on the implementation of a unique patient identifier. And because that will, among other things, save tens of thousands of lives a year. And a distressing number of patients die because the wrong drug is given to the wrong patient, or this sort of thing. And this is being received very warmly. The prospect of that ban disappearing is being received very warmly by the medical field. And although not directly related to consumer digital identity, oftentimes it's the government that's holding us back from actually implementing many of these technologies. And another thing that I mentioned very quickly earlier is the whole business with digital assets and central bank digital currencies. The big development in the last year or two is that China is going ahead very seriously with digital Chinese currency, with the intention of making it the the standard currency of the Belt and Road Initiative and eventually the world. This has a number of risks associated with it. We cannot, the free world cannot stand back and just let that happen. And so I think that the United States has to collaborate with the European Central Bank and countries throughout the world to make central bank digital currencies come into existence in a way that adequate privacy is preserved while avoiding all the obvious risks of money laundering and being used for nefarious purposes. And the role in blockchain is unclear in this. You can write down central bank digital currencies that they're completely dependent on blockchain, or one where it just have simple accounts where everyone has an account at the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or whatever, and you simply transfer balances from one to another. This doesn't disintermediate the banks and similar things, because there's real value added in getting that phone call or the text message when you find someone has stolen your credit card and it is being used elsewhere. That it's worth paying someone to really make sure that just because you can transfer these cash balances, that there is some piece of software and some responsible institution looking over your shoulder to making sure that your account isn't being emptied through identity fraud. And biometrics are going to have a huge role in all of this. I think although there have been real progress in public-private partnerships for things like the known traveler programs and so on, everything you have to do to get on an airplane rapidly. I think there's a unique federal role once in your life when you authenticate yourself as a U.S. citizen. For example, by going and getting a real ID card or a real ID driver's license, where there are fairly serious biometrics taken from you. And that once the government has taken that essential step of taking those biometrics and then deduping people so that it will no longer be possible to get one driver's license in New Jersey and another one in Illinois, which is really at the root of a lot of identity fraud. That when the government has taken that step, there'll be huge opportunities for the commercial sector to leverage that, to provide additional features to authenticate yourself as a member of a club or a graduate of Harvard or whatever it is, member of Amazon Prime. But starting with that root of identity. And so to try to get this all started, I recently introduced a bill with 4 bipartisan co-authors on the bill, H.R. 8215, the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2020, with Representatives Katko, Langton, and Loudermilk. And if enacted, this bill would take a number of steps to really prioritize the development of digital ID in this country, and starting with just bringing key stakeholders together. It would establish a digital identity task force within the Executive Office of the President that would include members from key departments and administrations such as Treasury, State, Homeland Security, Office of Management and Budget, Social Security and Administration, NIST, and GSA. Though you might wonder why GSA is there, since they can't apparently even count votes, but I won't go there. This would direct NIST to develop a framework of standards, methodologies, procedures, and processes as a guide for all levels of government to follow when providing services related to digital identity verification. And it would also establish a new grant program at DHS to help states jumpstart the modernization of systems that use things like digital driver's licenses and other types of identity credentials. The future of this in most people's eyes are the smartphone and the combination of the smartphone and a person and a person's biometrics to really be the first, second, and third line of defense against identity fraud. And there are impressive techniques already in a modern smartphone with better ones in the pipeline. And so I think, a future in which the combination of the person and the smartphone provides a pretty solid way of proving who you are is I think the future in this business, and it's going to be a public-private partnership that makes that happen. And this is going to be tremendously important for the American people. I think one of the biggest stresses in our country right now is just people's skepticism that government can actually do anything useful and proper. And I think having really high quality, easy to use, low friction digital ID will be so much help in people's lives that it's an opportunity for government on a bipartisan basis to show that government can be key in making your lives better. So anyway, I know there are a lot of digital ID experts on this webinar, and I'd love to hear all of your ideas and questions as well.
Thank you, Congressman. I have to say, I think you've just proven a hypothesis that I had, which is that it might actually take a physicist to truly understand the multi-dimensional nature of this issue. That was a very thorough and impressive run through of many of the issues that are critical to understanding the implications of good digital identity. So I appreciate that. I do want to remind the audience that if you would like to submit your own questions, there's a Q&A function enabled for you to do that. So please go ahead and do that. And if I may, Congressman, start with a personal question. What possessed you, an accomplished physicist, to run for Congress?
Well, sometimes I answer that by saying that I fell prey to the family's recessive gene for adult onset political activism. My dad was actually a scientist who left, he got a chemistry degree from Stanford, and he left science to become a civil rights lawyer, and ended up writing a lot of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the biggest steps forward for human rights in our country's history. But, you know, Dad got a chemistry degree from Stanford, and during World War II, he designed fire control computers for the Navy and started getting these field reports of just how many people had been killed each week by his team's equipment. So he'd grown up in the South. It was actually reading his papers after he passed away, he's almost 20 years ago now, that I started thinking about this question of what fraction of your life you spend in service to your fellow man, which is a question that science does not help you with at all.
No, it doesn't, but we're grateful that you have done that. You mentioned, I think, in your introduction that you may actually yourself be a blockchain programmer. Is that what triggered your interest in digital identity?
Oh, no, it's the frustration that everyone shared when you go into a hospital and you sit there and fill out all these forms and say, why can't I get out my cell phone, take a selfie, consult some appropriately secure database, prove it's me, and authorize people to suck in all of the, that happens in so many contexts with the government. Yeah. And then you read about what's happening in Estonia and places like that, and it just sort of makes your heart ache that we have all the technology and none of the political will to make that happen.
Yeah, not only that, it looks like we're going to have completely autonomous vehicles before we have the ability to walk from one doctor's office to the next and be the same human being. It's pretty shocking when you think about it that way.
Well, that's all due to my former colleague, Ron Paul. Ron Paul, actually, who I served with on financial service, is responsible for that appropriations rider that's for 25 years made it illegal to be able to go from doctor's office to another.
Amazing.
But it's interesting. What's changed in the politics of that, actually, is the opioid crisis. Because states, if you're going to prevent doctor shopping, where one patient goes to 6 different doctors, there is no alternative than to come up with a database of opioid prescribers or ultimately patients. And so that states have had to cobble together local compacts of states for a list of people taking, and so why don't you just do this nationally? And so that's really one of the things that's changed. When I'm trying to sell this concept to my Republican colleagues, many of whom come from rural areas that have been hit by the opioid crisis, you just say, okay, had this ban not been in place, a big driver of the opioid crisis, the doctor shopping, would never have been possible. And they say, okay, where do I sign up? It just,
That's great. It's a very, very good point and very compelling. Good point. So let's talk about the bill that you've proposed with a bipartisan group, which in and of itself is an unusual event in today's age. How did you manage to make that happen? Did you have to compromise in any way in terms of leaving anything out that you might have wanted to?
this is a first step at studying. It's very easy to get bipartisan interest in studying. And then you get the tough, whenever you propose anything that looks vaguely reminiscent of a national ID card, traditionally you sort of have the ACLU jump down your throat from the left, and then you have, what I sometimes call the Red Dawn people, the survivalists, the zero government people, jump down your throat from the right. And so when Representative Kelly and I proposed repealing this ban, we expected to just be clobbered. And so what we discovered is that I think we had one sort of pro forma letter of objection from the ACLU, but no big effort to try to whip the vote and get letter writing campaigns to get people to vote against it. And Representative Kelly tells me he got no objections at all from the right. This is also very fraught politically with the problems of comprehensive immigration reform. Because frankly, I am not going to vote for a high quality, secure, nationwide digital ID if it makes it impossible to operate in the United States, as an undocumented person. And so until we've had, what I hope will be resurrected, which is the fundamental bargain in the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill that actually passed the Senate in one of that rare moments when they did something, and it had the agreement that there would be a one-time amnesty for most of the 12 million currently undocumented. In exchange, there would be real enforcement, real workplace enforcement, and serious penalties for anyone that tried to hire someone who was not provably a citizen and legal to be employed. That's the way most countries hire it, and they don't argue about building walls and stuff to anything like that.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's a bargain. I think that's likely to happen in the coming years.
Good to hear. Actually, that leads to a question that just came in online that I think relates in a certain way to what you've just started talking about. And the question is that when you think about systems of good identity, really beginning to get off the ground, do you think this is likely to start at the state level? For example, a digital driver's license that can be used for eKYC or something, or at the federal level?
Well, I think that what I'm hoping is there will be federal standards for things implemented by states.
Okay.
This is an ongoing discussion about federalism, and everything from like gasoline mileages for cars. The standards. Do we want to have one standard for every state, or lowest common denominator? How does that work? And 50 independent standards is not economically efficient here. But there's a compromise that I'm a big fan of, which is to have any group of states representing, say, 30 or 40% of the population can come up with a standard, and they will all interoperate. And if a different group wants a higher or an easier to use standard, let them come forward, as long as they represent some critical fraction of the population. So you don't end up with more than a small handful of independent standards. And I think that's a very good compromise on federalism that may work here.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So in the bill, it directs the National Institute of Standards and Technology to set up a new standards framework. Is what you're thinking of there that given the criticality of interoperability and consistency, to a reasonable extent, that this can, is it your intent that this can be prescriptive? Congress can actually be prescriptive in driving that and in the necessary engagement with the private sector that would be needed to achieve that?
Well, there's a bewildering array of databases, lists of citizens, and no overarching list of citizens. And the government interacts, the list of I've seen at least a draft list of all the ways that the government uses the Social Security number, to try to get a unique identifier for people. And it's obviously, no good for any, it's useful as a serial number, but not as an authenticator. Although it continues to be, people pretend that it's useful for that. And so that, one of the most significant things is, all right, all of you segments of the government that are out there using the Social Security number, if there was a standard upgrade available, and this is what it would look like, would you use it? And I think, everyone who wrestles with those problems, would, I believe, adopt this pretty quickly. And at that point, making it mandatory would become less and less controversial.
Right. Good point. So the bill, in its sort of background setting, acknowledges that the private sector is driving a lot of innovation around digital identity. The task force is in the process, or would be put in place by this bill. How would you envision the private sector playing a role in that task force?
Well, the task force is initially just to get government to get its act together, but a lot of the government are regulators, things like banking regulators and so on, where they have to understand what the consumer-facing aspects of this will look like. And so I think it would be through the regulators that would be the main connection to established players in this. That's my guess. And also the tech connection is going to be big. It's not going to be government that specifies what's in the guts of a cell phone. And, during the big debate that we had about breaking into cell phones of criminals or suspected criminals, I actually had a chance to look over the innards of this, what's called the secure enclave of a modern smartphone. And, there are a bunch of smart people that have made very good, very good technical decisions on how to implement that. And even simple things like, the thumbprint reader. The thumbprint never actually leaves, you can snoop on the wired connection between the thumbprint reader and the processor. And you can snoop on that and learn nothing about what the thumbprint actually is because of the clever encryption that's been done on both sides of every transaction. And also, I have to be careful, but I've had briefings on what you can do if you're NSA level operator, when you get a piece of electronics and you want to take it apart and probe the contents of memory cells without disturbing them and things like this. And it's very impressive at the amount of human effort that's gone into making that possible. But it also tells you that with relatively inexpensive consumer electronics, you can make a pretty good, a pretty secure piece of electronics that will allow you to, to trust it, at least for medium value transactions.
Yeah.
There's going to be, I think one of the standards you need is going to be a sliding scale of authentication, which has been part of NIST's thought process for a long time.
Different situation. You're talking about large scale financial transactions, for example.
Yeah, and digital contracts, things like that.
Exactly.
I really I don't want to have someone sell my house in 5 milliseconds by holding up a photo of my face to the camera.
Correct. Got it. So how did you gather your research about, your own understanding and thus what you're pressing for in Congress around what the market needs or how to create security around digital identity? What avenues do you have for accessing information on an ongoing basis?
Well, I'm sort of a network of experts, is what's happened sort of informally. Very often when something important happens, like the whole debate about iPhone hacking, you get the government relations coming into my office and with their talking points, and I start asking them questions the government relations people can't answer. And they say, we'll get your experts. All right. And at that point, I have a friend for life because they like the idea that there's someone who actually understands how to design integrated circuits. And we're having a very interesting, right now, we just voted this morning in our caucus. So this is the Democratic Party, not the US Congress, but using an app that uses what's called homomorphic encryption so to allow you to vote without having your vote become in principle knowable, which is a very interesting and complicated thing to attempt to guarantee. But that's the sort of thing. But as a result of that, I've had conversations with 4 or 5 experts in the field who are kicking the tires of this and telling me if they believe when you actually look at the code in this thing, it's a solid implementation of homomorphic encryption.
Good to hear, because clearly we have issues in that area. Let's just leave it at that. It's really, I think, in this context, more of a question of the will to solve the problem using technology, because it's very clear that there are actually an abundance of technological solutions available, some of which are actually
I don't know, I'm a big fan of paper ballots. Fan of paper ballots. It's the former chair of the Princeton Comp Sci department has a very good YouTube out there called, I think it's Andrew Appel is the guy's name. It's called Internet Voting, Really? And he just deconstructs the whole concept of internet voting and everything that can go wrong.
Well, I think I was referring more to the sort of technological solutions for enabling people to identify themselves and avoid the prospect of fraudulent, duplicative, stolen and other, alleged frauds in the space that, I think there are many ways in which we could do a vastly better job without having to reinvent the wheel or anything even more complicated than that. And that, again, is really a function of will, perhaps.
Avoiding the surveillance state. I think if you're willing to tolerate the level of surveillance that anyone going to China has to put up with. If you're willing to tolerate that, you can make fraud very hard to take place. There are also some very delicate questions that people often talk about using blockchain to maintain your list of citizens, but then, which sounds wonderful because it's a non-falsifiable ledger. But then you say, okay, let's say that I have some former Russian spies that would like to live safely in England. What you need is essentially government-sponsored synthetic identity fraud. All right, and if it's on a blockchain, that is not technically possible. Okay, so that's the example of. You understand what I'm saying here, right?
Yes, I understand your point.
What you have to do is you have to go and mark up a bunch of old documents to fraudulently make a history for the people that you want to put in your witness protection program or whatever. And so that issues like that, get complicated fast.
So let me tell you that problem has an analog, which you'll appreciate, which arose out of GDPR and the European privacy standards. That included a legal right to be forgotten in the digital public domain.
Which makes no sense. Certainly in a blockchain world, it makes no sense.
Well, exactly. So in fact, there are some solutions that have been worked on in order to address that, but that's a story for another day. So
well, it's also very important because in the whole space of digital contracts, that I think it will be necessary for high-value digital contracts that they be backed by a court system that you trust. All right, and that is a competitive advantage of the free world. If I'm going to own my house, I do not want the contract that guarantees that ownership have the court of last resort in China. Okay, I just don't. All right. Whereas I will tolerate the United States and Canada. I'll probably tolerate Great Britain, but there's a rather short list of countries where I think I trust the court system. And so that means that the court has to have the ability to reverse digital contract, which means they have to have a very carefully guarded digital key that gives them a backdoor to reverse the contract.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that means you end up with something that's just as complicated as the key signing ceremony when they release a new version of an iOS. Because if that key ever gets in the wild, you have to throw away every iPhone that uses that key to demonstrate that it's a valid download of a new operating system. Anyway, now my iOS is now reminding me that I in fact have 145 people who have voted, who remain to vote, which is the point have to jump in my car and run over and get to the Capitol to vote.
Well, we will, in which case, let you go because we need you to vote. It just remains for me to thank you for your precious time. You're obviously someone whose work we're keenly interested in following and in helping in any way that we can. I hope you will see our organization as a resource. Again, we thank you for your service and for...
Okay, and I'm about to miss a vote here. It will get my chief of staff very angry at me. So
go run. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, everybody, I think that brings us to the end of our session. As Ethan noted, all of our webinar sessions have been recorded and will be made available on the website. And this session will be uploaded tomorrow. So we hope that you will share that with friends and colleagues that may have an interest. And thank you all for your attention.